In this lesson, we're going to be talking about dappled sunlight and shadow. And of course, that's part of the light. It's part of what's going on light-wise. And that's our goal, is to suggest the light. And like everything else we do when we're trying to suggest light, we have to simplify. And I've got a few paintings here of dappled light, as well as some photographs we'll talk about, and then focus more on composition and finding the shadow pattern. This is a painting by Willard Metcalf, early American Impressionist, early 20th century. Very strong on the light. Also, you can see very strong on the color, but real nice pattern of dark and light here. The key with the dappled light and shadow area, like this area in here, is either mostly sunlight or mostly light. You don't want half and half. And you don't want overly detailed, although Willard here did a good job of putting in quite a few bits of dappled light. But when you're as good as he is, you can do what you want. Typically, though, we want to simplify it. Keep it more simple. But when I look at like this area in here, I see it as mostly of the blue-green. So I block in the whole area blue-green. Mess with the edges a little bit, harden a few areas, soften a few areas, and then add the color of the light on the road and the light on the grass. If there's a lot of variation in the shadow, which we'll see some in a minute, you want to get all those variations in the shadow first. Make it shadow, get all the color variations, maybe some value variations, and then add the lights. Typically, you always think painting dark first, then light, and that's true. But if that dappled sunlight and shadow area is mostly sunlit, I would put the darks on top. In other words, I don't want to paint around small stuff. This is a good example. This is Claude Monet. And you can see mostly dark in this area. And mostly dark on the trunks where there's dappled light and dark on the foliage. So blocking this in first on the flat plane, that shadow area. Not going for the lightest shadow or the darkest shadow, but kind of that in-between value, that overall value that you see most of. Then before adding the lights, getting all this color variation in first and value change. He's got some darker areas, lighter shadows. It's all shadow, but there's maybe 2, 3 different values and quite a few different colors. And you want to get that in before you add the lights, which are going to be thicker. And you don't have to paint, you don't want to have to paint around these tiny dots of light. So get those color variations in first. And a lot of glare on this painting. But you can see the dappled light on the trunk also. Still that strong suggestion of cool and warm shadows in here. Even though they're fairly warm, they're not as warm as the sunlit areas. So you can have a shadow that's somewhat warmer, mainly because it's a larger shadow. And the bigger the shadow, the more ambient light comes in and bounces around. So you see more color, and the values get a little bit lighter. But don't mistake lighter shadow for sunlight. Keep everything in the shadow. And in most cases, I'm going to add the lights last, unless it's a big light area with just a few dappled shadows on it. But you can see these lights really stand out because they're a lot thicker. There's a lot of thinness in this shadow area, but that light is very, very thick. And typically, on the dappled light, around the edges of the light, it's a little bit darker, maybe a touch warmer, and in the center is slightly lighter, a bit more white. And sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can see it in the photograph, other times you can't. But it's typically that way. But I will have a variety of edges. You can see Claude here has got some soft edges there, harder, softer, real soft, a little harder. So that variation of hard and soft, especially in grass because there's so much texture in it, it's going to give you a variety of hard and soft edge. This is a large painting by Joaquin Sorolla, a Spanish painter. And I saw this one in St. Louis back in the 80s when they had a traveling show of his work, and the figures are bigger than life size. You can really see what he's doing on the canvas. And again, mostly shadow here. There's a lot of sunlight, but mostly shadow. But before adding these lights, he got all this color variation in the shadows. It goes from, all the shadow is cool, but within that cool shadow, it goes warmer, cooler, warmer, some darker areas, lighter shadow. but it's all shadow. And you get all those variations first, and then the last thing to be added with thicker paint is the lights. And simplify it. Now this doesn't look very simple, but you got to kick out the extreme artists, the ones that are so good. I have no idea how he did this and kept it simple looking. But you know, him and Sargent and some painters that handle the brush so well. Very detail oriented, but yet it had a real freshness to it. This is another Willard Metcalf. Really nice dappled light in here. Again, mostly shadow. So I would block this all in shadow and then add the light grass, light dirt. Of course, you got two different colors of shadow and some variation. There's some choppiness. Of course, Willard Metcalf always had a choppiness to his brush stroke. But there's about 2 or 3 different greens within the grass. Very close value. Same thing with the road. And then a lot thicker with the lights to make them stand out. And this is John Folensby. This one's a bit more complicated, a lot more broken color within the barn. So again, to make it simpler and easier to see, starting with the shadow, making all this shadow, starting with one color, you know, some kind of muted blue-violet with some orange in it. Then get the variations, making this a bit more orange on this side, some greens in there, some yellow greens in the shadow. A lot of color variation, real subtle value change, not much value change. And then the lights, which are a lot simpler and thicker, and just lay them in and then lose some of the edges in areas. You can see a real lost edge there, sharper edge there, little sharper, lost edge, sharper. So vary those edges. Typically you have to go back and forth. So after blocking in the shadow, blocking in the light, then I go back to the shadow, paint into that with, you know, just lose some edges, maybe making sure the shadow overlaps the sunlit area. In other areas I go back to the sunlit area and make sure that overlaps the shadow a little bit. You just kind of go back and forth until it starts to read better. And the dappled light on the tree trunk does not work as well. I think maybe because the value is too close to the value of the building, so it doesn't read as well. I'm not sure what the solution would be. I know the tree itself is darker than the house because the shadows are darker than the shadows on the house. So the sunlit area I'd make a little bit darker than the sunlit area on the house. And that would probably separate it a bit more. But it's a real nice painting. I don't mean to be just picking it apart. You do see things like that in paintings. Same thing here. Be careful with that dappled light and shadow. You don't get too much of a straight line on here. It can look a little stiff. Although with the cast shadow from the tree trunk, it's going to be a little bit straighter. But still, I would vary it, soften a bit more in places. Because to make things look more organic or natural, stay away from straight lines. Now here's some photographs we're looking at. And if we think about the dappled light you have down in here in the foreground, it's way too busy. I wouldn't paint it like that. I would keep it a lot simpler. And I'd also get rid of the sign. Now I can do that, not that I dislike the sign, but it doesn't help the painting any. I can do that in Photoshop, but I don't have to do that in Photoshop. I could, you know, just wait till the painting gets started in the drawing stage and just not put the sign in. Because it's fairly easy to get rid of things like that. It's not that big. I can see that the line back in here would continue and come this way, and the wall would come that way. So it's not that hard of a thing to take out. And I could just pick up the idea of the dark and light in the grass just by looking right in there on that side. If I'm starting out here with this painting, if I'm particularly looking at the background on the house, simplifying that a bit more, I'm starting with the darks, leaving some light area, but getting the darks a little more full, and then adding some lights back in here. You can see, just looking at the background building, adding a few lights, but making sure the darks, in this case, are dominant. Same thing in the shadow here. I've pulled together a lot of the darks, gotten rid of a lot of the lights in both the green grass and the dirt, and establish the color. And if there's any variation of color in here or in here, now's the time to do it. Because once I start adding the lights, it's hard to go back and start picking around and adding some color variation. And then I can add the lights in there. But I want to be careful that I don't add too much. I want the shadows, in this case, to dominate. And most of the time the shadows do dominate, but not always. A lot of times it can be mostly light with a few areas of dappled shadow. And then I'm putting that on top of the blocked in light area. But I did a lot less than the photograph shows in that dappled area, and you can see that. Simplified it a lot more. It just makes it easier to read. Now, I don't like these squared off strokes the computer gives me. With the paintbrush, I would vary the stroke. I can kind of roll the brush a little bit as I go along and press down, lift up a little bit more, and get a lot more varied shape. But it does give me a more simplified look, both on the church wall and on the foreground. And compositionally, again, when you look at things, look at your kind of focal point. Is it tall? Is it vertical? Or is it kind of long and horizontal? And here I have more vertical subject with the tall church and the steeple and then the trees. Focal point may be more in this area. And I would crop this several different ways, doing maybe a lot of thumbnails to figure out. I want that church, the front of it, the door, the steeple off center. And this area I like a lot better, as well as the dappled in front. This area over on the right side, not as much. So you can see I've got rid of a lot of the things on the right that just don't have anything to do with the tall vertical shape of the building and the tall vertical trees. But I didn't make it a real tall vertical. I think it's almost square. So this makes a square painting. I do have to be careful. I don't want the trees to be equal distance from the side, and that's what I have there. So I would probably move this tree over and then have it like that. Then it would be closer to the edge, and this one would be a little closer to center as well. So it's so easy to make it look symmetrical, like two sentry posts on either side of the center equal distance, and I don't want that. Now this painting too, we have again a lot of dappled light. I see mostly shadow, so I would block in the shadow first and lay the lights on top. And again, keeping the shadow more dominant than the light in this case also. Also made the shadows a bit longer, just to fill in a little bit more compositionally. And then compositionally too, there's, my focus here, would be probably this area, right in there. I'm not that interested in this thing, although I'm not going to get rid of it totally, but I don't have to paint it. And I don't need all this stuff over in here or here. So I can do a lot of cropping. So let's crop it and have this, my kind of focal point, a little off center to the right. And I don't mind the truck. I would probably put the truck in, I think. Don't have to, but I don't necessarily have to take it out. And I don't have to paint in the whole building. When you have something like that, the building, if it's the whole thing is in there, it's kind of squeezed in, composition just doesn't work as well. When it runs off somewhere, then it has a bit more of a feeling of space around it. And I want to crop a little bit of this building, not much. Because again, my focal point is here, or maybe even in here with that big cottonwood tree and the dappled light. Same thing on the dappled light on the rooftop. Mostly dark, so I'm putting this whole shadow right in here in one solid mass, and then coming back and adding the lights. And if I have dappled light on one side of a form, like a roof, I don't want dappled light on the other. I just want it on one side. If I have it on both sides, on an area that's turning like that, it can work, and you see it sometimes, but not very often. It's kind of like both sides being the same value. I don't want this and this being the same value. So if there's dappled light in here, I don't want dappled lighting there. And lastly, this one. This is all kind of in the same area, New Mexico. Some great small little mining towns and farming towns there. Great places to paint. A lot going on in here. Again, mostly shadow. So I would mass in these big shadow areas there, and probably mass in the light here, and then put a few of the shadows on top. But I wouldn't try and put both in at the same time, and I wouldn't try and paint around small darks or small lights. Mass in big shapes and then add the other value. And I look at this, there's a lot to kind of focus on. This gate with the tree, a lot of contrast there, some interest there, and also right here. So I'll probably have two different paintings there. So I want to focus on one or the other. If I focus on this tree with the bright yellow in the background, I can have a little bit of the gate. But I want to get rid of a lot of stuff on both sides and some of the foreground. And that'll increase the size of my focal point here. Still have the gate here, but my strongest darks and my brightest color will be in here. And if I want to make the gate the focal point, let's crop a little bit of that tree in, some of the foreground. The dappled light adds a lot of contrast. And now the gate's more of the focal point. I have to make sure I don't get it too centered, and it is off center. I could move it over just so the gate's right in there. And if the focal point is here, I would mute these yellows a little bit, doesn't have to be too much, and keep this my strongest dark and pop these lights in here, around in there.